On today's Studio Ghibli special, we have our frequent Studio Ghibli collaborator, Jimbob of Jimbob Talks Movies, back to talk about, quite frankly, maybe one of the most depressing movies I've ever seen. And notice how I don't include the caveat of animated in there, because fuck all those people that say that animated movies aren't that good. We're going to talk about Grave of the Fireflies on the latest episode of the Talkin TV podcast. I'm Dom, the movie nerd.
I'm Chris, the TV nerd. Man, this is an amazing film. If you guys have not seen it, please go watch this movie, then come back and see our review. And if you have, it's going to be a wild ride. So,
but be forewarned that if you do not have, if you are not have the stomach for the fate of subject matter, that I would definitely say to go in with go in knowing certain things about this. All of that and more right now. All right, starting off with expletives like I always do. Jimbob, man, happy to have you back, dude. It's been a minute since we've had you on.
Yeah, good to be back. Thank you for having me once again. I always appreciate the fact that you come and ask me, of all people, a nervous wreck to be on your show. It's amazing. Thank you.
Hey, man, like I always say, the reason I discovered you is because I was looking up Death Note content. You did an amazing review of the animated series, and I knew you were the guy to talk anime with. So we're happy to have you, man.
Yeah, and it's
appreciate it.
It's so funny because I feel like as we're getting like further down the Studio Ghibli train, further down into like the anime train, like it's so funny because I was a guy who I didn't discount anime at all. I was just never really into it because the TV shows that I know a lot of Chris, our mutual friends, watch definitely never seemed like they appealed to me. But I feel like just as with the Studio Ghibli train that we're getting into, I feel like it just continues to prove it's like, no, storytelling is storytelling. It doesn't matter what shape or form it comes in, and especially when it comes in the form of the movie we're about to talk about today. I mean, like, so this is my fourth Studio Ghibli film that I've watched. This is the third film that we've covered so far for this little Studio Ghibli, like, subchapter that we've been doing on the podcast, and oh man, like, I still don't even know where to begin as far as that goes.
I think since Jimbob, we gave him the honor as the guest of honor for the week, the choice of picking the film. I mean, I want to know, like, what inspired you to pick this one out of, like, we're only 3 movies in our Studio Ghibli series together, so this is a pretty bold choice for number 3.
Well, I just remember you asking me, you recommended Grave of the Fireflies, and I thought, okay, well, I'll see what else there is out there. So I remember sitting down on my sofa, and I watched Ponyo and Grave of the Fireflies. Grave of the Fireflies seemed like the more film aimed at simplicity, rather than one that's all over the place like most Studio Ghibli films and the deep messages and stuff like that. So to me, I think it resonated with me more that way because I could understand it more. And then when I sat down and watched it, I just remember sitting there afterwards for a solid maybe 20 minutes, just bawling my eyes out like a baby because it was that emotionally gripping. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anything this emotionally gripping in my entire life. And as you said, Dom, despite it being animation, it's still, God, I don't even know where to begin. It's amazing.
It packs a wallop. Yeah. If you guys missed the intro crawl, we're talking about Grave of the Fireflies today, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think was only like the second or third Studio Ghibli movie ever made. I mean, obviously they had Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, but that film was released before the actual founding of Studio Ghibli. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that this is their first. It's either this or My Neighbor Totoro is like their first major film overall. So
while you're looking that up, I looked it up, and dude, this movie's made $1 billion in Japan, over $1 billion just in Japan alone. It has like another 600 million worldwide. It's got 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, yet it seems to be forgotten in time. Yeah. That's one of the things I want to unpack during the course of this film. So, I mean, I guess why don't we just start there? Like, why do you guys think that this movie kind of has been cast aside? I would say.
Well, before we get into that, I feel like we have to talk about the story and kind of the incentive that goes into it, because I feel like a part of our little Studio Ghibli corner here is the fact that there is always so much that goes into the creation of these movies, and the fact that Studio Ghibli, Miyazaki, and all of his other amazing collaborators that he has, which we're going to talk about today, they always go into these. It's so funny because we've talked a lot about animation and animated storytelling and always why it seems to have like this caveat under it that it's made for kids, you know? And I think the biggest difference between specifically Studio Ghibli and a lot of other animation that we see, specifically American animation, is that American animation seems to be under the impression since day one, because of one Walt Disney, that it is exclusively for kids. If it's hand-drawn in any way, it's made for kids. And as the rest of the world has gone to show, that's completely the opposite case, because animated can still have just as much adult storytelling as the best live action film. And the thing that always impresses me is the fact that these creators go into this like ready to treat it like it's, for lack of a better word, a serious adult film with like real consequences. And it's so funny because, again, we talked on one of our previous episodes about the fact that Miyazaki is not a fan of most anime because so much of anime is about getting away and from the realities of life, you know. And meanwhile, Studio Ghibli only seems to enjoy getting into the humdrums and kind of the perceived monotony of real life. So as far as the development of this movie goes, so this is actually based off of a book by author, pardon me if I butcher the name right here, Akiyuki Nosaka, who said that many offers had actually been made to turn this book into a live action film. But however, he argued that it was impossible to create the barren, scorched earth that was to be the backdrop of the story because, to be honest, that type of setting hadn't been seen in Japan since the time period in which this took place, obviously. Again, like, keeping in mind that this is only 1988 when this film comes out. That's only 40 years past when the events of this film took place, obviously, again, with the tragic bombing of Japan. Like, it's not that far as
Right.
far as world history as far as world history goes. So after seeing the storyboards, Nosaku concluded that it was not possible for such a story to have been made in any method other than animation, and he expressed surprise at how accurately the rice paddies and the townscape and even the characters were depicted. He also argued that contemporary children would not be able to convincingly play the characters, and that's actually really fascinating, considering the fact that, I mean, this time period in general, again, like, kind of, we kind of look back at the World War II era with kind of these rose-tinted glasses because we are only, you know, kind of familiar with the American and, in this case, the British perspectives. But we forget that, again, war has winners and war has losers, and there are other perspectives that we never seek to consider. And the fact that this film goes so out of its way to reach so deep into like those gripping human elements that just underlie the tragedy that these people had to go through, like, just every day, like, just basically perceiving it like every day was like a living, waking nightmare, like struggling for food and everything. And the fact that, once again, like they always do, they managed to portray that in animated form just completely blows my mind as far as that goes. If I could just get my initial thoughts on this out of the way.
No, you're totally right, man. I have a list on my letterbox that I've been cultivating called my favorite war films of all time, and this quickly went in it. Like, I think this is another reason why I was bringing up, like, why has this film been forgotten, with everyone so rightfully so bringing different representation to the front lines of entertainment this day and age. I just wonder why this film's not thrown in the mix. I mean, this is a great example of just so many different things that we've thankfully been seeing more of in our entertainment. And I just think it shows that, you know, people got to go back and sort of get some history to really bring some perspective to things. And this movie begs so many deep philosophical questions like that. And, you know, to your whole remark about them not wanting to do this live action, I was really thinking to myself about that a lot while watching this film. And I was like, man, I could see this translated, but I could also see it, if executed the right way, be so grotesque and so hard to watch because it's children and because it's war and because how cold all these characters they meet to them are. But it's not because the people that they meet in Japan are cold people. It's like, we don't know what it's like being on this side of the war, you know, the side that we're on. And of course, we're generations out. And so it was so real. And I think you could execute this, but do you want to, you know, because it's going to be a difficult watch.
Right.
And so that's why I think it lends itself so perfectly to animation as well, because I mean, it's palatable this way. It's still haunting and it's still heart-wrenching, but I mean, there's just some things that you don't need to see the full scope of, and it really makes you think, man. It really makes you just like count your blessings. And like, I've never said that on this podcast about a film. And so here we go. It's really like the deepest thought I've had. I sat there after this movie concluded, and I'll toss it to Jimbob after this. I sat there for like 20 minutes just sort of staring at the black of the screen as the credits were up. And I was like, am I being dramatic right now? And then I thought to myself, well, I don't want to do anything, though. I just need to sit and think with this. And that's what I did, because it demanded that kind of respect. Like, what a film,
Yeah,
I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Jimbob, you got a kid, so I mean, would you have even been able to sit through this in its entirety if this were portrayed in live action? With all, I mean, we're having a hard enough time just trying to like explain it in its animated form. Like, if this were live action, I'm like, Jesus. Well, first off, I don't even think the movie would have been made if it was live action. But like, walk us through that process there.
It kind of makes you think, if it was live action, would it be classed as something extremely controversial? I mean, as having a kid as well, as you just said, I just sat there and as I watched the ending and just this poor little girl starving to death, it just really hit home on a lot of things. And it makes me wonder, like, as you said earlier, like, why is this film undermined? Why is it the least popular? Like, maybe it could be something to do with most Western animation or Western film in general. They have more focus on being from the soldier's perspective. This is more like a perspective of the aftermath and what the people around the world. And do you think maybe this sort of stuff is pushing the boundary of, say, they want to see these explosive action scenes, they want to see what the soldiers are going through, but aren't really interested in what's going on with the people around it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in Western society, a lot of our war films kind of depict the soldiers as heroes because, I mean, that's the way that they are presented on our news broadcasts. And historically speaking, especially with World War II, it was like, hey, do everything you can to support our boys overseas, right? The women went to the clothing factories, made like sort of, arms and stuff for them, like bandages, and then they were nurses and they were shipped. Everyone was doing their part. Like, kids were helping aid the war effort in certain ways if you go back and look at history, and that's because they were our heroes. But we forget that like everyone else sees their people as heroes, and when it's like a losing side, it's just, man, it sucks because the heroes if they can't protect the people, this is what happens. And yeah, man, I think showing this through first of all, this approach to the other side of war is brilliant in and of itself, but then having the foresight or the thought to use children, I mean, man, this movie's going to stick with me forever because not only is it a different perspective on war that we're not used to here because that's not what our Hollywood machine has given us for the most part, but then doing it with children too and pride. And I actually just wrote a paper on Japanese culture, and they're very prideful people, and so when they feel disrespected, that's something that they hold with them. And so him being disrespected and then taking the mantle of like, I have to look out for my little sister. And of course he's just a kid. What was he, 14 or something?
Yeah,
he was doing everything he could. And man, like just so many layers here that like, it kind of makes me like beg the question of Hollywood, where are you at? Like
it's always insane when you think about this because it's a matter of the Hollywood. We're so used to the Hollywood machine and dealing with, the latest Marvel schlock and the latest, Kong vs. Godzilla schlock. And like just the latest thing that the Hollywood machine is forcing down our throat in order to desensitize us and make us forget about the realities of the world. And then I watch something like this that does not want to run away from the realities of the world and the horrors of humanity and just what we're capable of, both the good and the bad. And it doesn't back away from it. It doesn't talk down to its audience. And it just tells the story as it is, like that's the stuff that I talk about when I talk about good storytelling, And Chris, you and I, we've been having a lot of fun talking about all those fun ridiculous action movies that we've been watching this last couple of weeks, and I'm just as much about watching a giant gorilla smack the shit out of a giant fire-breathing lizard as much as the next guy. But like when it comes to this stuff, and like it's just a simple story about a boy just trying to take care of his sister after they lose their parents in one of the worst time periods for Japan that there just possibly was, in a scenario that just keeps becoming more and more and more hopeless by the day. And even with that absolutely gut-wrenching ending being what it is, it still leaves you with a little bit of hope. You still get left with like it still manages to put in that little bit of Studio Ghibli whimsy. It still got all of these incredible themes just about like the death of innocence and the harsh realities of survival. But still managing to find those like little brief moments of life that are worth living. Like this, that's the stuff. It's the stuff that I watch movies for. It's the stuff that made me fall in love with animation, and the stuff that made me fall in love with good storytelling, and the stuff that just made me fall in love with movies in general. And this movie has all of that. It really, really does. Now, as far as some comments from the director, so this was directed by Isao Takahata, who was a collaborator with Miyazaki. He was his longtime partner and helped co-found the studio with him. He said he was compelled to film the short story that it was based off of, mostly because of how he saw the main character Seita handle himself. Again, he's a unique wartime ninth grader. He explained that any wartime story, whether animated or not animated, it tends to be moving and tear-jerking, at least the good ones, and that young people typically develop an inferiority complex when they perceive people in wartime eras as being more noble and more able than they are, and therefore the audience believes that the story has nothing to do with them. And I feel like that couldn't be more true as far as the American reaction to just war films in general goes. You know, like we sympathize with and empathize with the characters that we see, but at the end of the day, we're still kind of told that, like, oh, this could never happen to us. You know, it's like, yeah, that's awful for that person. They had to go through this, but, you know, that'll never happen to us. And this film just goes so in the opposite direction and just shows, like, the brief crushing humanity that these characters have to go through. And it makes it seem like, again, like just this innocent little girl who could be any of ours. It could be my niece, it could be your niece, it could be anyone that's related to us. And just seeing that and seeing what they have to go through, it's soul crushing. But at the same time, it's like, man, like this movie wouldn't work without it. That's the problem.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and the way they capture sort of the innocence of children in this film, and how, you know, they realize more than we think they do, but also how they still try and distract themselves the same way we do, like the whole fireflies being there, and sort of like the magic and power of nature. They're looking around them at this burnt down cityscape, yet they're so innocent, and like the whimsy of Studio Ghibli allowing them to find some beauty in what's going on. Like they do this terrible thing of giving you hope throughout this movie, and like it's so well executed because of that. But it's just like, you know, they know their characters so well, and they really capture just what it would really, like, they put you in the shoes of being like a ninth grader again, and having to, like, you know, I have a little sister, and like having to think about, like, man, like what would I do in this situation? Like I think he's doing all he can, and he's, you know, really carrying the burden. You know, he didn't even want to tell her that the mother passed away. Spoiler alert, right? He until the aunt revealed that, was shouldering the burden and doing a pretty good job of like sort of keeping her morale high. And so, yeah, Dom, I think you're pretty much totally right with like the way that we see our soldiers as heroes because of our perspective on the wars. And so, like, while we do empathize with them and see it from their side, we quickly turn off the movie and maybe even, you know, do a double feature, or, you know, go watch something else, because it doesn't resonate as much with us, because we do think, man, that could never happen here, I suppose, which is some of like what we've been taught through, like, you know, our Western perspective. It's where we were born. We can't really change that, but it was really refreshing to see the other side of it. And I think using children and just these innocent moments to sort of show like, hey, we're all the same, is really what I get from this film. And just beautifully done. You know, I mean, before we get too deep into like the minutia of it, that's really what I think this film does, is just the perspectives, man, and the way they make you think, especially being a Westerner, is just, it was brilliant to me.
Yeah. So, Jimbob, real quick. So, I find it interesting that the movie, that obviously, again, Studio Ghibli comes out, and they wait until 40 years. So, what do you think is the thought process that goes into it with them wanting to do this movie as, like, their first, like, major installment and, like, their first, like, major stance? Like, okay, this is what we're doing. And they make this, again, blatantly depressing but super gripping war movie. Like, what do you think is, like, going through their heads as far as, like, when they're making this?
Oh, okay. So since it was, say, for example, only like 20 to 30 years after World War II, I think if they're going to kickstart this massive studio, they're going to be like, to open it up with, you know, a banger. We need some real life tragic event to try and bring as many viewers in as possible. And it could have been something like that, because people are going to think World War II, oh, that was only 20 years ago. Let's go see this film. That's just how I see it anyway.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting thought process, because, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, World War II is obviously something that Japan is going to react to differently than the rest of the world. And I think it's a perspective that's kind of been just sorely missing from what is regarded as like one of the biggest pinnacles of just, you know, history and world history in general. And as far as this movie goes specifically, I think the only other time in recent memory that I think that this distinctive a stance was taken on the World War II setting was when in 2006, when Clint Eastwood did the double back-to-back debut of Flags of Our Fathers and Letters And Flags of Our Fathers is regarded as a little bit, it's not as well received overall, but Letters from Iwo Jima, which takes the Japanese perspective, ultimately is the much more well-received and the much more rewarded film. You know, kind of taking the perspective of the Japanese as they're preparing for, what's it called, for the inevitable atomic drop that's coming. And I find that really fascinating, especially since Clint Eastwood touted himself as a very big anti-war thing, because I feel that goes kind of in line with like the sentiments of the idea that this is a war movie. Because yes, while it does take place in a war setting, to me, this is the biggest anti-war film I think like you could ever get. You know, like to me, like there is no more of a definitive stance as far as portraying like the inevitable suffering of human beings, specifically the innocence that comes out from just the ultimate tragedies of war that come out of it, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, you know, it's again just using children, right? And being able to capture the mentality of a child in that situation is insane. And I think it's something that I don't think a Westerner could emulate because of like how our side of the war had happened. And I think it's one of those things that like really made this film stand out. And also another thing that really made this film stand out was the environments of which these characters were in, and sort of like having so few characters, you know, like really there was 4 leads billed at the end of the film, right? The brother, the little daughter, his little sister, of course, and then the aunt, and there was a 4th, I forget who it was, the mother. And so like you really are just spending a lot of time in the isolation that war creates, and that almost becomes sort of like an environment in and of itself, you know, sort of like, hey, we're because there's a lot of quiet moments in this film where they're scrubbing like leeches off the back of each other because they're washing themselves in salt water, and like just this river, and where they're, you know, then catching the leeches and cooking them in rice and just sort of like trying to survive and feed and fend for themselves. And it's that isolationist aspect is another hardship of war that we as Westerners have never really experienced, because we've fought most of our battles overseas. Obviously not like the revolution, but it's been a long time since then, you know? So yeah, I mean, Jimbob, what's sort of your take on, I guess, like the perspective of the children and how they add to the film? Like what about that really stood out to you?
Well, again, I think it just goes back to the question of, you know, of realism. Like kids were actually there in this situation. And what I respect about the directors in here is that they weren't afraid to take that sort of risk. And, you know, because, again, kids were there. It wasn't just the adults. So I think that's what stood out to me the most, just the fact it's just the most real film I think I've seen involving war. Like, it's so much more real than most Western media, most Western live action. There's just something about, the realism of the film that stood out to me the most.
Yeah, I think that also the thing that this does really, really well, that a lot of other like kind of Western media falls victim to, is it doesn't make everything kind of dour and depressing. You know, like as much as I enjoy Saving Private Ryan, which I've said famously is to me the greatest war film ever made. It's the best Spielberg movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I think that movie, kind of when the little moments do come out, and as good as they are, the focus of the movie is still just kind of like on kind of the misery of the situation, right? And the little moments when they come out, they're almost like refreshers and breathers but it almost feels like it's like intentionally manipulating you and setting you up for like, oh, when the next guy dies, or like when the next sucky thing happens that waylays them, you know? This film, and I don't know whether that's just a difference as far as Western sensibilities versus Eastern sensibilities, or if it's just of how fucking good these filmmakers are, but this film does such a good job of still giving you that whimsy and that kind of like childhood innocence. And it never once has to like have the brother have the conversation with the sister. It's like, this is war, everything sucks, and you need to start like acting your age. You know, like they never have that moment, you know? Like the brother is constantly just trying to protect the sister and preserve that sense of innocence, because he's still holding on to that hope that things will eventually get better, even though that is nowhere in sight as of right now, like a regular human being would, you know? So like it still maintains those humanistic elements. It doesn't feel like it has to sacrifice that for the purposes of pushing the plot forward, you know? It just exists in and of itself of the moment. And again, those are the moments to me that really let you like get into the character's skin, and those are the moments that really let you kind of understand the story in a way that just kind of like it's really that just most people just don't seem to get, you know? Because again, like it's the idea that most stories obviously have to be entertaining first and foremost, but it gets away kind of from the principle of storytelling, which is stories first and foremost are supposed to be fables and kind of cautionary tales more than anything else, you know? Like those to me are the best stories overall.
I totally agree with all that, man. I think it's sort of to add to what was impactful and powerful about this film, at least from my perspective, was seeing our main character, just a ninth grader, right? 13, 14-year-old kid having to go through the things he had to go through to provide. You know, they found this random, I guess it was maybe like a little fishing alcove where you could go in there and sort of like shelter from the rain if you were fishing by the pond, some sort of like public property that was abandoned, and that was going to be their new home because he just needed to get a roof of any sort over his little sister's head. And he eventually reverts to risking his life while the cities are being bombed, going in and stealing from people because not because he wants to be a thief, because he needs to then the next day go and trade the kimonos and sort of like the pots and pans that he's able to gather from these people's homes when they go to the shelters just to buy rice, to put food on the table. And that desperation and like Jimbob said, that realism of it all, I think is what makes this film incredibly powerful. And while it was an entertaining watch, I would even go in further to say that, yes, thankfully it was entertaining because it's so impactful and somber, but I think it's just, to me, this seems like necessary viewing. Like, you know, after watching this and sort of seeing with the way, you know, that everyone sort of like times are progressing in a positive direction, I feel like this film needs to come back to the forefront of conversation because it's just, if you truly want a different perspective of something, this is the film for you. And it's amazing to see how we're talking about, we're throwing into the hat, like, you know, Clint Eastwood war films and Saving Private Ryan, and how this animation film is up there with those titans, you know? It's not, sometimes it's not about the medium, it's about the execution. And I think that's one of the more powerful aspects of this film, is just how perfectly well done it truly was, you know?
And now you understand why I say fuck all those people who don't consider animated storytelling to be up to the caliber of regular storytelling, because 9 times out of 10, animated storytelling is 1,000 times better than most of the shit we get that's live action now. There is a reason why I will go back and watch the same goddamn Pixar movie 50 times over rather than like a new film that may or may not be good, because I know for a fact that Pixar storytelling, not only is it going to be great, not only is it going to be rewatchable, but it's also going to just contain those factors that let me come back to it over and over again and let me get something new out of it every single time, because it's just that deep, because it's just that intrinsic, because the amount of care that is put into those characters just seems like there's just so much more thought and care put into it, because it's animated, because these animators sometimes have to slave over this stuff for like 4 to 5 years at points just to make sure it gets right. It's 4 to 5 years it sometimes takes to get these things out. So, of course, it's going to seem like it contains more thought and effort and more nuance than most films, because it does, you know, because it's more time. Because it's funny, I was watching this interview with Mike Jones, who was one of the 3 writers who did Soul recently, again, best movie of 2020, and he said that, yeah, if you have 4 to 5 years to get a movie right, it's like, and the movie still doesn't come out right, like something's seriously off, you know? And then think about like just the amount of bad animated movies that we still get on a daily basis, you know, and take that into consideration. Now, at the risk of getting
real
too
quick,
far,
think about this, man. Back then, they didn't have any computer programs that helped them generate and mass produce stills. This was all hand drawn, frame by frame.
Yep.
And it's so incredibly meticulous because of that, and in a most beautiful way. It has this human quality, you know. You really feel the pen to paper on this one.
Yep.
And did you guys notice the little filmmaking thing they did where they would sort of shake certain stills to show like just like the you know, the I would say despair of what was happening on the screen? You know, it was bad enough that we're watching his little sister die in front of him and you know, lay her head down after eating watermelon for the final time, but then they have this almost like human, like not computer generated After Effects sort of shake, like really just like, whoa, like I can't even hold this frame in my hand, it's that powerful on this, like so much in there, man, so much in this film.
Yeah. And
sorry, what were you gonna say, Dom? I just wanted to get that in there while we're still sort of close to that.
There were two other points that I wanted to bring up before we really dove into kind of because you've been talking a lot about why this film, it seems like it's kind of been lost to time as opposed to having like the amazing cult following that most other movies do. And I've been saving the reason for, because I know why. I know exactly why it is, but I've been saving the reason for the end of it. But there were two things that I wanted to bring up first before we get into that. So, and of course they are from the creator. So Takahata said that he considered using non-traditional animation methods, but because the schedule was planned and the movie's release date was set and the staff was assembled, there was no room for a trial and error type of approach. And he also remarked that since he had difficulty animating the scenery, since in Japanese animation, one is actually not allowed to depict Japan in a realistic manner, animators often had to travel to foreign countries in order to do research on how to depict them. And such research had not been done before for a Japanese setting. And another interesting thing is, as far as the specific animation goes, most of the illustration outlines are actually done in brown rather than the customary black, and with black outlines only used when it was absolutely necessary. And color coordinator Michio Yasuda said that this was done to give the film a softer feel, which I think is done, again, like, it's such in perpetuity, because, again, for a film of this like graphic subject matter and with this deep a message and with this like somber a tone, it's like you need like some form of you need like some form of like visual warmth in order to like wrap, you need something to kind of like get you through with it and kind of like trick your brain into thinking, oh, things might turn out well for these guys at the end. They're totally gonna make it out alive.
That's so incredible. They had the foresight to implement that palette, because it totally comes across as soft and warm, and I think it doesn't ease the blow, but it at least makes it like, if it was against a harsher color, the black, I can totally see this film even being more depressing after I concluded it. And you really feel the warmth in like the Firefly scenes. Those were so human. I couldn't believe it.
I got a point that I'm going to bring up about that and how that ending might be one of the best endings that I've ever seen, because it just does that thing that I love that these types of movies do, but I'm going to save it.
Not even just the ending, though, for me. It's like every time we had those Firefly moments, they were so intricately and expertly woven into sort of like this disparaging moment we had just witnessed, and then we get like this relief with the Firefly where these children are like, hey, we're making the best of it. I still have you and you have me, and we're here for each other, even if no one else around us is. And I just, the symbology there was just brilliant. And now that you say that color palette, no wonder it felt so warm. They really did hit that nail on the head.
Yeah.
But Jimbob, man, what's your take on like the palette and sort of that artistic choice there? Did it resonate with you kind of like it did with us, or what's your take on it?
Yeah, pretty much exactly the same as you guys, because I mean, I've watched so many live action war films, and the color palette is kind of grey and dark, but in this film it's kind of colorful. It gives you that soft, that soft feeling, as you just said. And even though the film is depressing, but it also gives you, as you said again, that sense of hope that things may turn out all right. But this is war at the end of the day. Not everything is going to turn out all right, and it's not always going to end the way you think it's going to end. People die, and that's war.
Yeah. So I feel like, as far as like beginning the process around to like move towards the wrap up point, the one thing that I did want to say. So Chris, with Jimbob, we've been talking a decent bit about how, again, what was it you said, film? Chris, this film, like, what, grossed almost $1 billion in Japan, and it's like the #1 animated movie there for a while. Like, what were those stats that you brought up again? Read those off for me again.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull that up right now as we're speaking, because it was pretty groundbreaking to see. I mean, it has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's like
how many movies
the critics
have 100% on Rotten Tomatoes?
Not many, and I don't know how much that matters, but what I do know is it's hard to get such a universal, like, sort of stance on something, and the fact that this film has that just speaks volumes to it, because, and that's another reason why I was just kept asking myself, like, man, if like the critics are still touting this thing, 1988, we're in 2021, like, why does it seem like this has been lost in time? Is it too heavy for audiences? I mean, there's a lot of sort of questions there. As I pull up the sort of gross figure, the profit, then I was just like, man, like this was by all intents and purposes a hit. It made $1.7 billion in Japan alone.
Yeah,
516 million in the US. Yeah. And I'm sure tons more money if I look up, the European and other audiences.
Yeah. So I have the reason as to why it is not remembered, I think, to the extent that it is. I mean, obviously, again, just I feel like the stance of Studio Ghibli has always kind of like had a weird niche audience, Again, like even amongst movie fans, it feels like their movies aren't talked about nearly enough. But what happened was they did that thing where the initial Japanese theatrical release, because this movie was so heavy, they're like, okay, we definitely can't release this on its own. So they did a double release along with Miyazaki's much more lighthearted and child-friendly My Neighbor Totoro. And even though the two films were both marketed towards children and their parents, the starkly tragic nature of Grave of the Fireflies turned away many, many audiences. Meanwhile, Totoro, which was also heavily merchandised, particularly the stuffed animals of Totoro and Kappa, sold extremely well after the film and made overall profits for the company that allowed it to stabilize their production, because Grave of the Fireflies, they were shaping up for it to be a miss. So that's probably part of the reason why, and also why it hasn't been remembered as well, because again, people are going to want to remember the fun, cutesy, like giant stuffed animal like creature habit, as opposed to the starkly tragic war movie that ends with child death. So I think it's safe to say, like, why one film has been remembered and one film has kind of been lost to time, to say the least. Not to shit on My Neighbor Totoro in any way. We haven't gotten to that one yet, but I've heard like amazing things about that movie as well. But like, I think that kind of like shines a light as far as why this film hasn't had the legs that it has deserved.
No, you're totally right, man. But you know what's crazy? My Neighbor Totoro, while that is a big hit, this movie made more money than it.
Really?
This movie was a bigger. Yeah, this movie was a bigger hit. It's crazy that they were shaping up for this to be a failure. It's certainly a different tone. While I think Miyazaki and his films sort of tackle these types of undertones and these types of sort of disparities and important societal questions, they clearly do them under the guise of more friendly, more fun, like flashing light style.
Definitely
look
more
at
like
Spirited
a
Away.
Feel to it, like more of a
yeah,
fantasy,
like Spirited
more of
Away,
like a heightened adventure feel to it.
Exactly. Like, Spirited Away does tackle some serious issues, but like you can choose to buy into that aspect of the film, or you can choose to buy into the fantastical world building. Like you said, this one's definitely, this is all you're getting, it's this or nothing if you're watching this film. But yeah, My Neighbor Totoro only grossed 41 million in the United States.
Interesting.
And Grave of the Fireflies, if Google is correct, which they normally are, 500 million. That's a big difference there.
That is a pretty big difference. And it's why, as much as I did enjoy this movie, I think it's why I still have this ranked number 2 under Mononoke, because I think the thing that Mononoke did so well is Mononoke was able to, again, take everything that we've seen so far from the Studio Ghibli, having that like really intrinsic, important message about nature, like kind of showing like the studio and creators' anger towards just our treatment of nature overall, and kind of, and meshing it within this like crazy heightened adventure with like these giant animals and these crazy epic wartime sequences and these really actually like interesting and kind of cool villains that you don't even think are villains until you realize at the end like kind of what their role is. And this movie goes for the starkly realistic, and that kind of like is where it falls as far as on the spectrum. So,
and the last thing I'll add, I just looked up about this whole, while we're sort of talking about the difference between these two films, which came out within the same time frame. Totoro has made in the 1.6 billion, but a lot of that comes from, VOD sales afterwards and merchandising. Whereas this film, I think, was just so impactful in the moment that, because these are, the box office numbers are very different, although they have went on to make a similar profit margin as time's gone on. It's interesting to see,
Yeah. So the last thing that I really wanted to break down before we do our ratings is the Fireflies themselves. It's in the title. The movie is called Grave of the Fireflies, and I think the movie does an extremely, again, just it's the thing that Studio Ghibli does best, is using these incredibly like small things that you think are just going to be like throwaway moments and then making them like the epicenter of the movie, like the epicenter of the metaphor. Like when they're first playing with the Fireflies and the little girl accidentally crushes one, and then she just wants to get a new one, and then she asks her brother, why do the, where do the Fireflies go when they die, and kind of like that whole sense of like using the Fireflies as the metaphor of what comes after, if there is kind of an afterlife, for lack of a better word. It's kind of a stance that, again, a lot of different movies have tackled. Again, like I feel like, again, it's a thing that it feels like a thing that Western animation is just not allowed to touch, obviously just because of the influence that the Catholic Church has had for so long. But again, now that we're kind of like, on the hindsight of that, it's interesting to go back and look at these movies that were able to like kind of get these themes in there, like kind of under the guise of like, like these animated, well, not in this sense, but in other films, kiddie fair. And again, comparing this to Soul, how Soul was able to kind of tackle the idea of life and death and make it seem like so palatable and so understandable. And I can't help but notice that this film kind of has a lot of origins for that, in the sense of where, even though the film doesn't do that thing of having like, the cross back and forth, are there spirits and things, this film isn't interested in that at all. It's very, very interested in the realistic elements, but how they balance it out and offer up like this coda, of once because I want to stop calling them like the brother and sister, like, so I want to get their characters right. Once Seita finally dies, kind of bringing it full circle to the moment that we saw that opens up the film and is reunited, and he's reunited with Setsuko at the end. And they get off that train, and they're kind of embreshed in the Fireflies, and they're kind of just sitting on that little bench overlooking, their modern city. You got to assume, like, again, like 40, 50 years, who knows? Like, obviously, we got to assume that's at the time the modern day cities, or at the time 88 cities. So it's been 40 years now that these two haven't been alive and on this earth. But the film handles it so tactfully as far as saying, oh, we're not necessarily saying that this is better or worse or anything like that. It's just, again, it's what Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli does best, is just showing this is the logical next step. This is what comes next, And the fact that it's just they've finally gotten that peace, and that, that they were trying to find throughout the entirety of the movie, that they just couldn't seem to find in life, It's again, it's the thing that I love that Eastern movies do so well, is how they handle the balances of life and death, is that they show that they're not afraid of it. It's not this great thing to be scared of. It's just kind of the logical next step. And I really haven't seen a lot of other movies that have been able to handle that as well. Like, I'm almost getting choked up just talking about it now, but, like, it's so fucking powerful and so good as far as how they handle it. Like, do you guys have anything else to add to that? Because I really don't know how much longer I could go on with that without starting to tear up. Because
the one thing,
damn.
I totally share that feeling, man. This was I definitely almost cried at the end, and I just had to sit there and sort of take it all in. But the one thing I can say is, like, the use of bugs in this film, sort of how nature has a way of sort of taking away pain or taking back what's rightfully, hers in the first place. It's like those maggots on her mother when she was, taken off to the mass grave to be sort of burned, like the symbology there behind that. And then the Fireflies later on in the film sort of appearing as sort of like a reprieve, a break from the intensity of the moment. Even though they knew things were terrible, they at least had still some wonder left in the world. And just the way that this film is able to sort of like tie that sort of aspect of, like at the end of the day, we're all living on the same rock, and look what we're doing to it. We're destroying it with our weapons, with our machinery, and just sort of that aspect of it. In, like, I'd say the early times of where we've progressed to now, clearly we're a little more, I'd say, conscious of our imprint on the world, and
a little bit.
And it's just so well done, capturing this all through the lens of a child, and seeing how much they truly do realize, and how often we write them off. It's just powerful on so many levels. And the Fireflies, you might dismiss those maybe if you're not really trying to study this film as you watch it. But to me, without them, it still would have been impactful. But just it enriched the experience tenfold. I mean, what about you, Jimbob?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as you said at the start of that thing, Jess, you said you almost cried. I think we're polar opposites on that aspect, because I cried probably more than I ever have in any other film in my entire life. The fact that I'm following these two characters, which don't have that much character development to them, they're more like just two people trying to survive. They're not just looking after each other, they're also flawed, and especially the brother. He's that desperate to look after his sister, so he goes off and he steals, robs things. And if he just listened to this old bloke who said, suck up your pride and apologise to the aunt, if he did that, they probably could have had a fighting chance. But again, it's realistic in the terms of he's a teenager, he's stubborn, he wants to fend for himself. And I think when the little girl eventually, I think that was one of the most emotionally impactful things that I've ever watched on the screen.
Yeah. No,
yeah.
Couldn't agree more as far as everything that goes. And the last point that I wanted to say was the ending of this movie specifically reminds me of one very other, I feel like, noticeable ending from a movie that has certainly gotten questionable reviews and reactions over time, which is Gangs of New York. It's a movie from Martin Scorsese that kind of has been lost to time, and I feel it doesn't get the appreciation that it deserves because they regard it. I think the movie's a little bit too bloated, and it's got a little bit too much going on for its own good. But again, that's Scorsese. That's what you want from a Scorsese movie. And I think that movie personally is really underrated. I really enjoy that movie, but the ending of that movie gives me this really interesting kind of thought process as far as how it goes along with the themes of that movie, where at the end of that movie, you see DiCaprio and Kate Winslet at the graves of both Bill the Butcher and his father, played by Liam Neeson in the movie, and they're buried right next to each other, kind of this stance of them being enemies in life, but in death they're reunited as friends. And then the movie does this really cool fast forward where it fast forwards to the modern day New York at the time when the movie was released, 2002, and it shows how the Greys slowly become covered up. And it's almost like, again, like these guys who fought so hard to maintain their claim of ground in New York at the time are just lost in the 100 years that surpassed them, and they're completely forgotten about. And again, like there's no one left alive that's going to be there to like continue on that legacy, And this film kind of has a similar ending as far as how it's portrayed visually, but as far as what it means metaphorically, it feels like it means something completely different. Where even though, Even though Seita and Setsuko will not be remembered and will most definitely be lost to time, as far as, the residents of modern-day Kobe, their city, the fact that they can sit there and their spirits can kind of take solace in the fact that their city survived and is now kind of stronger and prospering, and there's just a really small sense of comfort that comes from that I feel like really like seals this as far as just, being a perfect movie, and as far as, leaving you with like just that little glimpse of hope. Is like, as shitty as things always do seem in the moment, there is always hope for the future, even if it takes like, in this sense, 40 years, and in other senses, even if it takes 1,000 years to get there, there is always kind of gonna be that sense of hope. There is gonna be the light on the end of the dark hallway. It's really fascinating and it's really interesting. And like I said, I wasn't because it's been a while since I've seen something that probably made me think this hard about a movie. Probably not since Princess Mononoke or even Soul. When I watched that, have I seen a movie? In this case, sure, I just named off animated examples, but I'll just label them as movies in general that really made me think that hard existentially, just about like, us as human beings and our role and kind of, what is the purpose of life, if there even is a purpose, or if the purpose is just to kind of like go through and kind of stumble our way through until we inevitably move on to what's next. It's crazy again that these movies continue to make me think this way, but again, that's just the beauty and the magic of storytelling.
Yeah, no, the finale to me just speaks to like, the power of family and sort of what we believe as humans. Like, there is an afterlife. Every religion, race, creed has their own sort of example of that. And so they've come together, they found each other, and, they were, I guess, unfortunate casualties, but they at least get to sort of watch their country, which, didn't do wrong to them really. It just was trying times, and they get to sort of like look over there on the precipice, looking down on this city and sort of seeing like, okay, life moves on and we might not be a part of the physical world anymore, but at least we're together. And it was just a very somber moment too. Like it was like sort of a melancholic sort of like happy, sad type feeling, but at least they found each other, man, because I think family is another underlying message that we didn't quite touch upon too much, but clearly if you watch the film, you'll understand that people do anything for family, whether it be good or bad. But yeah, Jimbob, any closing thoughts before we sort of hit our reviews and rate this thing?
Any closing thoughts? I'd say, yeah, I think again, when it comes back to the realism thing, I mean, I know I've mentioned realism a lot in this, but I think the frames of animation is also something which really fascinates me on this, because the attention to just characters simply licking rice off their feet, eating, just even something as simple as tying your shoelace. There's so much detail put into it. I mean, it must be like 20 frames just for someone to tie the laces, and then you go watch an animated show on which has like 3 frames, and that's an action scene. So it actually fascinates the amount of detail that was put into it to make it look like these people are real. And then as you watch the film, it's like you start to believe that these are real people, and you kind of forget that you're watching animation.
Yeah, no, absolutely,
Yeah.
like 1,000%. It's probably again, I know I've said this a lot, and I said this at the beginning of it, but this really was the first animated film that I would say that made me forget that I was watching an animated film. Like, even as much as I loved Soul, which again is a movie that I've referenced a lot in this conversation, probably because I did rewatch it again this past week, which dealt with a lot of similar themes with this. Even that had a lot of those moments that reminded me, okay, I'm watching an animated movie. This is probably the first instance. And even the previous Ghibli movies that I watched, like Mononoke and Spirited Away, and even The Wind Rises, the first Ghibli movie that I watched, they had those moments that reminded me, okay, this is still an animated movie, but this really did have those moments where I'm like, holy shit, like I'm not even watching an animated film. I'm really just watching a movie. And
Shit, like
if I can get into closing thoughts, the only thing that I really have left to add to this is just like this is just good storytelling. It's just great storytelling that, again, it sucks that it had to come out of, again, probably the worst period in Japanese history. But again, that's what they say. Tragedy leads to some of the best stories, you know? And just for... It's so strange because I can't necessarily recommend this movie because this does not kind of go under the banner of like a rewatchable movie at all. But like this is the type of movie that like I really do recommend that just everyone watches just to like learn a little bit something more about themselves and learn a little bit more about real life and learn a little bit more about just the human condition and what like just, you know, other people other than themselves have to go through, you know? And it's really tricky because, again, I rated a certain thing on Letterboxd, but the more and more I think about it, I'm like, nah, there's not a single flaw that I have with this entire movie. The animation is unabashedly gorgeous. You know, it just reminds me, again, of hand-drawn animation. The characters are so fully fleshed out. The emotional moments in this movie hit harder than, like, the emotional moments of, like, the last 5 movies that I've seen just in general. And, yeah, this is a perfect movie. This is a 5-star movie for me, no question.
Yeah, this film is the perfect example of why we need perspective and storytelling. And I think everyone needs to go back and sort of watch this because, man, we can't forget history or else we're bound to repeat it. And God forbid something like this ever happens to a people again, you know? And just the fact that like it makes you really beg that type of question. Whereas you're right, Dom, like the past 5, hell, the last like 50 films I've seen haven't really made me think this deep. And I'm really glad it did because I sat there after the film and I was just mulling over all sorts of thoughts and sort of, you know, counting my blessings and just thinking about like the world and how I can contribute more. And like that really never happens. I mean, because it was so genuine and it captured these children in a way that I haven't seen done in quite a long time, if ever. So for all the reasons we said prior in this podcast, and just because I think, especially now, right now, in this moment, this is a very important film. I would beg you guys to go and watch it. It's 5 out of 5. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this movie. It's perfect. What about you, Jimbob?
Hands down, 5 out of 5. No flaws whatsoever. 100% agree.
Yeah. Well, without a doubt. Like, this is a perfect movie, people. And it sucks because it's so funny because I told Chris that this was going to be on HBO Max with the rest of the Ghibli movies, and then it turns out, nope, licensing problems. I don't remember what the specifics of it are, but it's like, nope, licensing problems, so it was on Hulu. I'm like, okay.
But you know what? Hulu didn't give me commercials for the first time ever.
That is true. That is true. But, I mean, I pay for Hulu with no commercials. I'm like, nah, I'm not dealing with that shit. Like, I looked at the price differences between the two. I'm like, I'm sorry. It's not that much of a difference. It really isn't. I'll pay the extra $2 or $3 a month that it is for no commercials. I'm not doing that shit. Like I'm a spoiled Gen Zer who is brought up who came of age in the age of streaming. I'm not dealing with commercials anymore. But
damn, fair enough.
With that little bit of levity kind of thrown in there in order to kind of elevate this rather somber conversation that we had about this movie, people, that was it. That was the latest episode of our Studio Ghibli Corner with Jimbob, where we talked about Grave of the Fireflies. Again, not a movie for the faint of heart, but if you do want to watch something that is emotionally gut-wrenching, is going to make you think in ways that you never thought before, and has some of the most brilliant animation I think I've ever seen of any movie, I could not recommend this movie more. Go watch it. It's on Hulu. Unanimous 5 stars all around the board. So with that being said, I also wanted to give a great shout out to our guest, Jimbob. We love having you on, dude. We can't wait to have you back on for the next one, and we want to keep collaborating with you going forward. So where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Okay, the good people can Jimbob Talks Movies. The name is right under the screen. The new direction I'm taking in my channel at the moment is reviewing really, really bad films and just roasting anything dumb about them. So if you want kind of a comedic take on some reviews, where to find me, name below.
I love it. I love it. I mean, I've been trying to get Chris to... Chris has been telling me about some bad movies that he's been watching. I'm like, Chris, I love you, but you do not understand what truly bad movies actually are. Like, I have seen some shit, you know? And if I can just shout out one recommendation to you, Jimbob, look up... I don't know if you're familiar with the works of author Neil Breen, but you have got to look up a movie called Fateful Findings. Fateful Findings. If you could write it down and look it up and find it, it is a treasure trove of just terrible movie making, but it is one of the funniest things I think I've ever seen. It is absolutely hilarious. So, without further ado, of course, Chris, the TV nerd, Evanko, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, they can find me anywhere that matters, as I like to say, at Christian Evanko. Evanko spelled Evanko. I make music. I have another podcast called Talkin with Andrew and Chris, which is a show about life, music, and everything in between. I have a great time doing this type of thing. That's why I have so many different outlets. Hit the link in my bio. Check out my music, my other podcast, and of course, continue to support this show. We'll get into all that in a second. But before we do that, Dom, what about you, man? Where can the people keep up to date with your comings and goings?
Well, let's see. I think I made a sarcastic post the other day about on my Facebook page, but I gotta check it, because like I said, I see so many things coming and going on the interwebs that I usually forget. I think the most recent thing that I posted about the Space Jam 2 trailer on my Facebook, and I said, so Space Jam meets Ready Player One with Don Cheadle as the villain. Sign me the fuck up. This shit looks awesome. And that's pretty much what I do on my Facebook and Instagram, which is at Movie Nerd Reviews. The most of the actual Movie Nerd Reviews can be found on our actual Facebook and Instagram pages for this channel right here, which is kind of my lifeblood and my reason for living right now, which is, of course, Talkin TV Podcast, at Talkin TV or at Talkin TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. That's where you guys can keep up with everything that we are doing throughout the week. We just did a massive schedule change, so we've got a lot more stuff coming down the pipeline for you guys. And again, if you click the subscribe button, if you click the like button, if you leave a comment, and if you just let us know in general, what are some more things that you want to see from our channel in general. I click the bell next to the subscribe button. That way you guys can get notified every time we put up new content. We've got so many different things coming down the pipeline. You guys are not ready for it. But of course, we'll be back for more Studio Ghibli Corner at a later point. Again, we kind of always do them as like these one-offs, but we always love them because we're always rewarded both by the movies themselves and by Jimbob's presence whenever we actually do them. So, without further ado, thanks once again for tuning in, people. Please go watch Grave of the Fireflies. 12 seasons in a short film. And as always, watch more fucking movies. See you guys in the flip.